Ann Harper sat at the kitchen table in her home outside Atlanta, staring into her now cold coffee, and thought about how her days had become one endless series of repetitive actions, where each evening her husband would come home from work, they would eat dinner in silence, and then go to their separate corners, he to the TV with the news, she to a book or her computer, day after day, with no spark to remind her that their lives had once been full of conversation and plans for the future. She was 48 years old and a manager at a small insurance company downtown, where her days were spent processing claims, calling clients, and meeting with coworkers who seemed as tired of the routine as she was. But Anne never complained out loud because she believed that at her age, complaining about life was a sign of weakness, and she had always tried to stand firm, just as her mother had taught her as a child in a small town in Ohio. Her husband, Tom, was 2 years older, an engineer in a construction firm where he designed bridges and roads, and although his job brought in a steady income that allowed them to live in a comfortable two-story house with a garden and a two-car garage, Tom had long since lost interest in anything outside the office and home, preferring to spend his weekends watching football or tinkering with odds and ends in the garage, where he could be alone with no one to interact with except his tools. And recalled how they had met 25 years earlier at a frat party at the University of Georgia, where she was studying business administration and he was studying engineering, and Tom had been full of energy, making fun of her attempts to make the Italian pasta she had learned from an immigrant neighbor, and they could talk for hours about their plans for the rest of their lives, how they would build a house and have children and travel the country by car, staying in small motels and sampling local food at roadside cafes. Now they had a daughter, Sarah, who was already in college in Boston and called once a week to tell them about her psychology classes and her new friends. But these calls only emphasized the emptiness in the house, because afterward Anne felt even more alone, sitting in the living room with Tom, who nodded in response to her stories about Sarah, but didn't ask questions, didn't share his thoughts, just sat with a beer in his hand and watched the commentators analyze the Atlanta Falcons game on the TV. Their life was comfortable on the surface, they paid their mortgage on time, they took vacations once a year, usually to Florida by the ocean, where they rented a condo and spent time on the beach. But even there, conversations were limited to the weather or what they were having for dinner, and Anne found herself looking at other couples holding hands or laughing at jokes, and wondering why things had become so predictable for her and Tom, so mechanical, as if they were simply acting out parts in a script someone else had written years ago. On the morning of the day when this strange feeling of alienation had begun, Anne had woken up earlier than usual, at 6 o'clock, and was lying in bed listening to Tom's even breathing beside her, who always slept on his back with his hand behind his head, and she thought about how long it had been since they had hugged each other for no reason, or talked about their feelings, or about what was troubling each of them deep down inside. She got up quietly, so as not to wake him, put on her dressing gown and went down to the kitchen, where she made coffee in the old coffee maker they had bought in the early years of their marriage, and sat at the table, looking out the window at the neighbor's yard, where Mrs. Johnson was already watering the flowers, despite the early hour. Anne worked in an office from 9 to 5, and her days were filled with routine tasks, checking policies, emailing clients, the occasional meeting with agents who came to discuss new contracts, and she loved her job for the stability, for being able to help people through difficult times when they had accidents or illnesses, but lately even that had begun to feel empty, because she watched colleagues her age retire or change careers, and she remained in place, afraid of the changes that might upset the balance in her and Tom's lives. Tom would get up at 7, shower, dress in his usual uniform, a short-sleeved shirt and khakis, and go downstairs, where Anne would already be making breakfast, porridge for him and toast and jam for herself, and they would eat in silence, checking the news on their phones, exchanging only short phrases like, "They're predicting rain today," or "Don't forget to pick up the parcel from the post office." "Morning, Anne," Tom said, sitting down at his desk and pouring himself a cup of coffee from the thermos she'd left out for him, his voice flat and emotionless, the way it had been for years, as if he were talking to a colleague at work rather than the wife he'd spent more than half his life with. "Morning, Tom," she said, still looking at her phone, where she was reading an article about how women her age dealt with menopause and body changes, and she thought she could talk to him about it, but she knew he'd just nod and say something like, "It's normal, everyone goes through this," with no desire to probe into her feelings. They ate quickly, and Tom stood up, kissing her cheek a light, familiar kiss that had long since lost all meaning, and left for work, saying, "I'll see you this evening. Don't stay at the office too long." Anne was left alone, washed the dishes, and went upstairs to change. She chose the simple blouse and knee-length skirt she wore to work, put on pale lipstick, and looked in the mirror, noticing the new wrinkles around her eyes that had appeared in the last couple of years, and thought about how time changed not only her body, but also how she saw herself not as a young girl with dreams, but as a middle-aged woman whose life revolved around her responsibilities to her family and work, with no room for personal desires or discoveries. At the office, Anne sat at her desk in an open space with 10 other people and started the day by checking emails. There were inquiries from clients about car insurance, complaints about late payments, and an invitation to a corporate business ethics seminar that she had marked on her calendar, even though she knew it would be another boring lecture about the importance of being honest with clients. Her colleague, Linda, a woman about her age, came over with a cup of tea and sat on the edge of the desk. "Hey, Anne, how was your weekend? Bob and I went up to the mountains and hiked the trails. It was so refreshing after all the office hustle and bustle." Anne smiled, although she felt a twinge of envy. Linda and her husband always made time for such trips, while the last time she and Tom had gone anywhere alone had been 2 years ago. "It's okay, Linda. We were just relaxing at home, watching movies and gardening," Anne replied, trying to sound cheerful, but Linda must have noticed something in her tone, because she leaned closer and said quietly, "You know, sometimes I feel like after 20 years of marriage, you have to change something. Otherwise, everything becomes like an old record that's stuck on the same track. Don't you feel that way with Tom?" Anne hesitated, unsure whether she should share her thoughts with her colleague, but finally nodded. "Yeah, I think about that sometimes. Life goes on, and we feel like we're standing still. The kids are grown, our jobs are stable, but somewhere inside, there's an emptiness." Linda sighed. "I understand, honey. Bob and I went to therapy a couple of years ago, and it helped. We started talking more about our feelings, planning things together. Maybe you should try it too," Anne shrugged. "Maybe, but Tom's not the type to get emotional. He prefers things to go their own way." After lunch, Anne went for a walk to the nearby park near the office, where she often sat on a bench, eating a sandwich and watching the people, young couples kissing under the trees, older men walking their dogs, mothers with their children, and it always made her feel a mixture of nostalgia and sadness, because it reminded her of her own life at different stages. When Sarah was little, she and Tom would take her to the park on Sundays, play ball and eat ice cream, and it had all seemed meaningful. But now that Sarah was gone, those memories only emphasized how far they had grown apart. As Anne sat there, she took out her phone and dialed Sarah, who answered on the third ring. "Hi, Mom, how are you? I'm just on my way to a social psychology lecture." Anne smiled at the enthusiasm in her daughter's voice. "Hey, honey, I just wanted to hear your voice. How are school and new friends?" Sarah laughed. "School's fine. I've been reading a lot about how people build relationships. You know, the professor said that in long-term marriages, it's important to stay connected or everything falls apart. How are you and Dad? Are you okay?" Anne paused for a moment, not wanting to bother her daughter with her own problems. "Yada, business as usual. Working, waiting for you to come home for the holidays." They talked for another 10 minutes about small things: the weather in Boston, Sarah's plans for the summer, and when the conversation ended, Anne felt relieved, but also sad, because her daughter, without realizing it, had touched a sore spot. How to maintain a connection in a marriage when the years have erased all the sharp edges, leaving only a smooth but cold surface. Back at the office, Anne continued working, but her mind was elsewhere, thinking about how her body had changed over the years, how she'd gained extra pounds after Sarah was born that she'd never been able to lose completely despite trying to go to the gym a couple times a week, and how Tom never commented on it, but he never complimented her like he used to when they were young, and he'd just come up to her and hug her and tell her she was the most beautiful woman in the world. That evening, driving home through the busy streets of Atlanta, cars honking at each other in traffic, Anne listened to the radio host talking about midlife crises and how many people her age were beginning to rethink their lives, wondering about meaning and what they'd missed. Am I in this story? She thought suddenly, and the thought stuck in her head like a splinter, because everything in her and Tom's life revolved around roles. She was a wife, a mother, an employee, but where was Anne the person, with her desires, dreams, and fears? At home, she cooked dinner-baked chicken with vegetables, a recipe from an old cookbook her mother-in-law had given her, and waited for Tom, who arrived at exactly 6:30, as always, hung his jacket in the hallway and said, "Hello, dear, how is your day?" They sat down at the table, and Anne decided to try to start a conversation about something more than the weather. "Tom, remember when we went to New York for our 10th anniversary? It was so much fun walking around Manhattan, eating hot dogs on the street." Tom nodded, munching on his chicken. "Yeah, good times." "Why?" Anne continued. "Maybe we should go somewhere again? Just the two of us, without plans, to freshen things up." He looked at her with mild surprise. "Maybe, but I have a big project at work, a bridge across the river, no time for traveling now. And Sarah is coming soon, it's better to wait." Anne felt disappointed, but did not insist. "Okay, whatever you say." After dinner, Tom went into the living room to watch the news, and Anne washed the dishes and sat down with a book, a novel about a woman who changes her life after a divorce, but the words blurred before her eyes as she thought about the trust in their marriage, how it was still there but weakened by routine, and the family responsibilities that held them together but prevented them from growing individually. As Anne lay in bed that night, listening to Tom snore, she considered the moral dilemmas of whether to fight for the relationship or accept that it had changed forever, and the personal growth she felt she needed, but didn't know how to begin without destroying everything around her. The next day was the same, with slight variations. Morning coffee, emails and meetings, lunch in the park, where she saw a middle-aged couple sitting on a bench, holding hands, talking quietly, and it made her feel envious and sad. In the evening, they had spaghetti for dinner, and Anne tried again. "Tom, what if we took a dance class? I saw an ad for salsa classes downtown that might be fun." He laughed briefly. "Salsa? At our age? I'd rather play golf with the guys from work." Anne nodded, but something inside her broke. She realized that their relationship crisis was deeper than she thought, and that age-related changes affected not only their bodies, but also the way they saw each other. The internal monologue did not subside. Am I in this story? Or am I just a shadow of the Anne who once dreamed of more? As the days passed, Anne began to notice small details that underscored the disconnect. Tom forgot to buy milk when she reminded him, and instead of apologizing, he simply said, "I'll buy it tomorrow." At a family reunion at his sister's on Saturday, they sat around the table with relatives, swapping stories about work and children. But when the conversation turned to future plans, Tom talked only about retirement, and Anne remained silent, feeling like an outsider. At a cafe with her friend Mary on Sunday, she confided, "Mary, sometimes it feels like we've lost ourselves in our marriage. Don't you and John feel that way?" Mary, divorced 5 years ago, replied, "I did, and that's why I left. But if there's love, it's worth fighting for. Trust and conversation are the key." Anne began to think about social dilemmas. What would friends and family say if things changed? And how personal growth required courage that she perhaps lacked. By the end of the week, after another routine trip to the supermarket, where she bought groceries according to a list that had not changed for years, Anne got into the car and cried quietly, realizing that the coldness between them had become the norm. But she no longer wanted to live in this shadow of habit. Am I in this story? She repeated to herself, and this question became the beginning of something new, although she did not yet know what. Ann Harper stood in line at the coffee shop on the corner of Peachtree Street, a few blocks from her office, clutching her phone where she had just finished reading a text from Sarah about how she was studying for her psychology exam, trying to distract herself from the night before, when Tom had gone back to the garage after dinner, leaving her to do the dishes and feel like their house had become a museum of their past lives, with every object, from the old couch to the photographs on the mantel, a reminder of the years when they had still shared dreams. The shop was full of people. Businessmen in suits discussing contracts, young women typing on laptops, and behind the counter, a barista in his mid-20s with a tattoo on his wrist and a wide smile, deftly manning the coffee machine and bantering with customers. Anne ordered her usual latte with skim milk, and while she waited, she saw the barista Nate, according to his name tag, wink at the older woman as he handed her the coffee, and she laughed like she was 30 instead of 70. It made Anne smile a little, thinking how rare it was for someone to make people feel noticed like that, so simply and genuinely. When it was her turn, Nate turned to her. "Skim latte, right? I've seen you here a couple times this week. Always the same thing, like clockwork." His voice was light, with a hint of friendly teasing, and Anne, to her surprise, felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "Yeah, habit," she said, slightly embarrassed. "It's easier than having to figure out what to get every time." Nate nodded, drying his hands on a towel. "I understand, but sometimes it's worth trying something new. Like, we have a seasonal pumpkin spice latte. It sounds corny, but I love it. Would you like me to add some to your order? On me, just to shake up your day." Anne hesitated, not used to such attention from strangers, but his open smile and lively gaze, in which there was not a drop of formality, made her agree. "Okay, let's try. But if you don't like it, it's your fault." He laughed. "Agreed, Anne. I'm ready to take responsibility." She was surprised to hear her name, and he pointed to her office badge, which she forgot to take off. "I'm just a good observer." This short exchange, so ordinary at first glance, left her with a strange feeling, as if for the first time in a long time someone really looked at her, and did not just pass by, like Tom, who no longer noticed her new blouses, nor the fatigue in her eyes. Anne sat down at a table by the window with 2 cups her usual latte, and a small pumpkin spritzer that Nate had insisted on trying, and took a sip and thought that it did taste unusual, with a hint of cinnamon and something warm, almost cozy, and it reminded her of the time she and Tom had shared hot chocolate at the fair their first year of marriage, laughing when he'd spilled it all over his jacket. But sitting in the coffee shop, surrounded by the buzz of conversation and the clinking of cups, she felt not just like a wife and mother, but like a woman who could indulge in a little adventure, even if it was just a new flavor of coffee. She glanced at Nate behind the counter, chatting with another customer, and thought he was probably 15 years younger than her, with his trendy haircut and an energy she hadn't had in a long time, but his interest, albeit professional, was a breath of fresh air in a room where she was suffocating with routine. Back at the office, Anne couldn't concentrate on her work. She checked policies, answered emails, but her mind kept returning to that brief conversation, to the way Nate had called her by name, as if she were more than just another customer in line. It wasn't romantic, she hadn't even thought of it that way, but the attention, the genuine ease of conversation, made her wonder, when was the last time someone had looked at her as if she were interested in herself? It had been a long time since Tom had asked her about her day, what she thought of the book she was reading, or how she was handling the pressures of a job where her boss was hinting at possible layoffs. She remembered Linda, her coworker, telling her that marriage took work, but now she wondered, what if working on a marriage meant not only talking to Tom, but also finding yourself outside their home, their habits, their silent dinners? The next day, Anne went to the same coffee shop again, although she could have gotten coffee from the office, which had its own coffee machine, but something drew her to the place where she had felt a little more alive the day before. Nate was there, and seeing her, smiled. "Hey, Anne, is that pumpkin spice latte in, or am I on the blacklist?" She laughed, surprised at how easy it had been. "I admit, it was nice, but I think I'll go back to my usual routine today. I don't want to take too many risks." He shook his head, feigning disappointment. "Oh, Anne, you're breaking my heart. But okay, one classic latte for a lady who knows what she wants." While he made the coffee, they chatted about the weather, how Atlanta changed every year, how the traffic was worse than when she first moved here after her wedding. Nate explained that he worked at the coffee shop to pay for the photography classes he took at night, and that he dreamed of opening his own studio one day. You know, he said, handing her the cup, I've always thought that everyone has a story worth capturing. Your eyes, for example, are so. Like you've been through a lot, but you're still ready for something new. Anne felt her cheeks flush a little and quickly replied, Oh, you're just a good salesperson, good at giving compliments. But inside, her heart was beating a little faster, not from love, but from the fact that someone had noticed her as more than just a woman who ordered coffee. That evening at home, Tom was in his usual mood. After work, he'd brought pizza from their favorite place on the corner, and they'd eaten at the kitchen table, debating whether to fix the old lawn mower or buy a new one. Anne tried to talk about her job, about how her boss had mentioned a possible raise, but Tom had just nodded. That's good, honey. More money wouldn't hurt. She'd fallen silent, realizing he'd missed the point, her worry about whether she'd have the strength to handle her new responsibilities at an age when many people were already thinking about retirement. After dinner, he'd gone to watch baseball, and Anne had been sitting on her laptop, browsing the website for the photography course Nate had talked about, and she'd wondered if she'd try something new, not for Tom, not for Sarah, but for herself. The thought had been a tiny crack in the wall she'd spent years building to keep her life together. The next day, she was back at the coffee shop, and Nate saw her and said, You're becoming a regular, Anne. Maybe I can give you a VIP discount. She smiled. Only if you tell me how your photography class is going. Have you done anything cool yet? He brightened up, started talking about his latest project, a series of portraits of people on the streets of Atlanta, and asked her to come see his group exhibit at a local gallery in a couple of weeks. I'm serious, he said. You'd look great on camera. You have something. Real. Anne waved him off, but his words stuck with her, and she thought that maybe there was a space beyond her family, her home, her work, where she could be not just a wife or a mother, but just Anne, a woman who could still be surprised and happy. By the end of the week, she found herself waiting for the morning to go to the coffee shop, not just for the coffee, but for these little conversations that made her feel seen, that her thoughts and feelings mattered. It wasn't an affair, there was no hint of anything illicit, but these moments with Nate, so simple and raw, made her wonder, what if she deserved more than routine? What if trust in marriage wasn't just about fidelity, but also about being honest with yourself? She remembered her friend Mary talking about the importance of not losing yourself in a relationship, and she wondered if this crack in her life could be the beginning of something new or the end of everything she knew. Ann Harper walked along the sidewalk along Piedmont Park, where the autumn leaves were just beginning to turn yellow, falling onto the paths, and the breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass mixed with the aroma of hot dogs from the cart out front. She held a paper cup of coffee in her hand, which she had bought from a different place than Nate's, away from his office, so that no one she knew would notice her meeting him for lunch. It was their third outing that week, unplanned, almost accidental, starting when Nate texted her. Hey, I have until tonight off, want to go for a walk. I promise not to make you try another weird coffee. Anne hesitated, her fingers hovering over her phone, but then, as if given in to some inner impulse, she replied, Okay, but only for an hour. I have a meeting at 2. Now they walked side by side, and Nate talked about his latest photo shoot in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Atlanta, where he captured the play of light on old brick walls. There was something magical there, he said, waving his arms, like time had stopped, and you could see the world changing, but still the same. Anne listened, and his enthusiasm, his ability to see beauty in the mundane, made her feel younger, like she was a student again, discovering the world, rather than a woman whose life had long been scheduled by the hour. They stopped by a pond where ducks swam lazily in circles, and Nate pulled out his phone to show her some of his pictures. Here, look, he said, leaning in so she could see the screen better. That's the guy who sells flowers at the market. I caught him smiling at a customer. That's when you realize everyone has something special. Anne looked at the photo, but she was more aware of the warmth of his shoulder next to hers, the faint scent of his cologne, something fresh and citrusy, not at all like the heavy scent Tom had been wearing for years. She found herself thinking that she liked being around Nate, not because he was younger or better looking, but because he looked at her with genuine interest, asking questions, listening to her answers as if they actually mattered. "Have you ever tried photography?" he asked, putting the phone away. "You have an eye for detail, I can tell by the way you talk about your work." Anne laughed, shaking her head. "Oh no, I'm too busy with insurance policies and reports to think about anything creative like that." But he persisted. "It's never too late, Anne. You'd look good holding a camera. I mean it." Those words, so simple, made her feel important, wanted, like someone had seen potential in her that she'd long forgotten she had. Later, when she got back to the office, her cheeks were flushed, and not just from the autumn sun. She sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, where another document with client data was open, but her mind was elsewhere on the way Nate had touched her elbow as they crossed the street, on how he had suggested they meet again, maybe on Saturday, to go to a photo exhibit at the gallery where his work was being shown. Anne had written him a short message. "Sounds interesting, but I'm not sure yet. Let me know where and when." She sent it, and then immediately regretted it, because a pang of guilt had stabbed her chest, not for anything in particular, since they had just been walking and talking, but for not telling Tom, for the fact that it had been her little secret, hidden like a teenager with her first crush. The guilt was mixed with something new, almost forgotten the feeling of freedom when you do something just for yourself, without looking back at the expectations of your husband, daughter, or colleagues. That evening, Anne was at home making dinner, salmon with lemon sauce she'd found on a new food blog, something different from their usual chicken or pasta. Tom came home from work a little later than usual, tired, with a folder of blueprints under his arm. "It's been a tough day," he said, sitting down at the table and opening a bottle of beer. "The clients are changing their plans for the bridge again. This damn bureaucracy." Anne nodded, setting a plate in front of him. "I know, I'm stressed at work too. My boss is pressuring me with reports." She wanted to say more, maybe even mention the walk in the park, but instead she asked, "Tom, have you ever thought about trying something new? I don't know, a hobby or a trip?" He shrugged, cutting off a piece of fish. "Why? We're fine, work, home, Sarah's coming home soon. What else do you need?" Anne fell silent, knowing he couldn't hear her real thoughts, and that silence lay between them like another wall she didn't know how to tear down. The next day she got a text from Nate. "Show Saturday, 10th Street Gallery, 6 p.m. Will you come? It'll be great, I promise." Anne sat in her car in the office parking lot, staring at her phone, her fingers shaking as she typed a reply. "I'll try, Nate. Thanks for the invite." She knew that Saturday was Tom's usual golf day with his colleagues, and she could leave without arousing suspicion by saying she was going to meet a friend. The thought of planning a secret meeting was both terrifying and exciting. Guilt gnawed at her because she had never lied to Tom, not even about the little things, but at the same time she felt her heart beat faster at the thought of seeing Nate again, of hearing him laugh, of feeling like not just a wife, but a woman who could be interesting, attractive, alive. On Saturday, Anne put on a simple blue dress she'd bought a couple of months ago, but had never worn because Tom hadn't noticed when she tried it on at home. She looked in the mirror, fixed her hair, touched up her lips, and told herself, "It's just an exhibition, nothing special." But inside, she knew it was more than just a night out. The gallery on 10th Street was small, white-walled and softly lit, and hung with photographs of students in Nate's coarse black and white portraits, landscapes, street scenes. Nate met her at the door, wearing jeans and a shirt with his sleeves rolled up, and his smile was as open as it had been in the coffee shop. "I'm glad you came," he said, touching her shoulder lightly. "Come on, let me show you my work." They walked between the photographs, and he talked about each one. The old woman feeding the pigeons, the child running after soap bubbles, the couple dancing in the street to the music of a busker. Anne listened, asked questions, and with each word she felt her ordinary life, with its reports and dinners and silent evenings, fading into the background, and in its place something new, almost tangible, like a breath of fresh air after a long stay in a stuffy room. It was dark when they left the gallery, and Nate suggested they go to a nearby cafe for a glass of wine. Anne hesitated, knowing that this was crossing some invisible line, but she agreed. Just one glass, I have to be home by 9. The cafe was cozy, with wooden tables and soft music jazz, which reminded her of evenings with Tom when they had first started dating. They talked about life, about dreams, about how Nate wanted to travel around South America with his camera, and Anne confessed that she had always wanted to go to Italy, but Tom thought it was too expensive. You should, Nate said, looking into her eyes. Life is too short to put off what makes you happy. The words struck a chord inside her, and she felt her cheeks heat up again, but this time she didn't laugh it off. She got home later than she had planned, around 10, and Tom was already in the living room, watching a replay of the football game. "Where have you been?" he asked, still glued to the screen. "I thought you were with Mary." Anne nodded, feeling the lie burning in her throat. "Yes, we stayed up late, talking about work." She went into the bedroom, closed the door, and looked at herself in the mirror, feeling two emotions warring in her chest. Guilt about Tom, who, despite the coldness between them, was still her husband, and a desire not to let go of this new breath, this spark that made her feel alive. She thought about social expectations, what would her friends say if they found out, and about moral dilemmas. Where is the line between loyalty and the right to happiness? As she lay in bed, she listened to Tom's footsteps down the hallway and thought about Nate, about his words, about the way he looked at her, and she realized that this crack in her life was getting wider, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to fix it. Saturday morning at the Harper house began with the usual rhythm. Tom had gone to the golf course with his colleagues, leaving a note on the table asking for new batteries for the remote, and Anne was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, leafing through a magazine she had bought at the supermarket the day before, but her thoughts were not about articles about autumn recipes or fashion trends, but about the previous evening when she had returned home from another meeting with Nate. This time they had walked through the botanical gardens, where he had photographed the flowers and secretly taken pictures of her, laughing when she tried to cover herself with her arms. Her phone was lying on the couch, and every few minutes she checked to see if he had texted, even though she knew he was working at a coffee shop until late that evening. Anne found herself smiling as she remembered Nate talking about his childhood in a small town in North Carolina, catching frogs by the river, and how he asked her what she liked to do as a child, and for the first time. System told him about her childhood in Ohio, about how she and her friends would steal apples from the neighbor's orchard. That smile, those memories, the ease with which she shared stories with him, that she hadn't even told Tom it was all new, like she was discovering parts of herself that she had long forgotten. But along with that warmth in her chest, there was a growing guilt that she tried to push down, reminding herself that nothing was wrong, that she and Nate were just friends, that this wasn't cheating. But every time she lied to Tom about where she was going, that feeling grew heavier, like the rock she carried in her pocket. Anne decided to go downtown to buy batteries and do some shopping, hoping to take her mind off things. At the mall, she was wandering around the clothing aisles, trying on a scarf she probably didn't need, when she heard a familiar voice say, "Anne, is that you? You look like $1,000,000. She turned around to see Mary, her friend, standing there with a shopping cart and a big smile. Mary was divorced, energetic, and always ready for gossip, which made her both the best and worst conversationalist for Anne at the moment. "Oh, hi, Mary," Anne said, adjusting the scarf around her neck and feeling her cheeks warm. "Just taking a stroll, updating my wardrobe." Mary narrowed her eyes on her. "You're looking so radiant, my friend. New face cream, or something more exciting?" Anne laughed, too quickly. "Just got a good night's sleep, I guess." But Mary didn't let up, coming closer. "You know, I saw you last week at the botanical gardens with some guy. Not your Tom, that's for sure. What's the story?" Anne felt the blood drain from her face, but forced herself to smile. "Oh, he's just a friend we were talking about. Photography. He's a photographer." Mary raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Okay, dear, but you know you can tell me if you need to. I can keep my mouth shut." Anne nodded, feeling a lump in her throat and quickly said goodbye, citing urgent business. When she got home, she found that Sarah, their daughter, had arrived from Boston for the weekend without warning. Sarah was sitting in the kitchen, eating an apple, looking tired from the long drive. "Mom, where have you been?" she asked, looking at the bags in Anne's hands. "Daddy said you left a couple of hours ago." Anne put the bags on the table, trying to speak calmly. "Yeah, I stopped by the mall to pick up a few things." "What, did you think you were going to surprise us?" Sarah smiled. "Yeah, I thought I'd get away from class for a couple of days. But Mom, you're kind of different. Is everything okay?" Anne froze, not expecting such a question from her daughter. "I'm fine, honey, just stressed out with work," she replied, but Sarah frowned, as if she didn't believe her. "You've been going out a lot lately," Sarah said quietly, looking at the apple. "I'm just worried, you know. You and Daddy are so distant." Anne felt her heart clench. Was her change so noticeable even to her daughter? She hugged Sarah, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "We're just tired, honey. Adulthood, you know. But it'll be okay." But the words sounded unconvincing even to her. That night at dinner, they ordered Chinese because no one wanted to cook. Sarah brought up the conversation Anne had been dreading again. Tom sat across from her, scrolling through the news on his tablet, barely participating. "Mom, I was reading about midlife crises for school," Sarah began, stirring her noodles. "People sometimes start looking for new things because they feel stuck. Don't you feel that way?" Anne nearly choked. "Sarah, I'm fine, really. It's just, sometimes you want something fresh, that's all." Tom looked up from his tablet. "Fresh? You wanted to sign up for some dance, right? I told you to go if you wanted to." His tone was indifferent, and it cut Anne harder than she expected. She nodded, at a loss for words, and quickly changed the subject, asking Sarah about her schooling. Later, when Sarah had gone to her room to call friends, Anne sat in her bedroom, staring at her phone, where there was an unread text from Nate. "Took a picture of the sunset over the river today, was thinking of you. Want to see the pictures tomorrow?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to answer. She wanted to feel again the warmth his words and attention brought her, but the fear of exposure washed over her like a cold wave. What if Mary told someone? What if Sarah started asking more questions? She imagined Tom finding out, his usually calm face twisted in pain or anger, and the thought was unbearable. But at the same time, she couldn't stop thinking about Nate, about the way he made her laugh, the way he looked at her like she was the only one in the room. That feeling of being wanted, of being alive, was like air she didn't know she was missing. As Anne lay next to Tom, who was reading something on his phone, she thought about the trust she was breaking, the family she might destroy, and the freedom she was so afraid of losing. She hadn't answered Nate that night, but his message burned in her mind like a beacon calling her into the unknown. The pressure of her surroundings was growing, and the fear of being found out was becoming real. But a part of her, the one that had awakened in recent weeks, didn't want to return to the shadows of habit. Sunday evenings at the Harper house dragged on, like those long hours after work when Tom would sit in his favorite chair in the living room with a beer in his hand and the TV remote, channel surfing between sports and the news, and Anne would do her own thing, either doing laundry in the basement or reading a book in the kitchen where the light from the lamp fell on the table, making her feel even more isolated in their large but empty house, which they had bought 15 years ago when Sarah was still a baby and would run from room to room, filling the space with laughter and noise that was now sorely lacking. Anne had just returned from a quick trip to the grocery store. She told Tom she needed to get milk and bread, but really she just wanted to be alone in the car, listening to the radio and thinking about the text from Nate that had come that morning. "Hey, last night's sunset was okay, but it felt incomplete without you. Let's meet up this week if you can get away." She didn't answer because the fear that had settled in her after talking to Sarah and Mary had become too strong, but the text still warmed her insides, reminding her of those times when she'd felt like she wasn't just a wife in a routine, but someone who could be the center of someone's attention, and that feeling warred with a guilt that burned inside her like acid, eating away at thoughts of family and the trust she'd spent so long building with Tom. Tom was in the garage when she got back, fixing Sarah's old bike that had been sitting there for years, and Anne thought it was his way of avoiding conversation because he'd become even more withdrawn these days, answering her questions curtly and disinterestedly, as if they were neighbors instead of people who'd lived together for over 20 years. She'd set her bags down on the kitchen table and was starting to unpack her groceries when she heard her phone beep, a new text message, probably from Nate, and she'd quickly snatched it up to look. But at that moment Tom had walked into the kitchen, wiping his hands on an oil-soaked rag, and his gaze fell on the screen of the phone she was holding. "Who's texting?" he asked, his tone flat, emotionless, but there was something new in his eyes, a suspicion she'd last seen when Sarah had sneaked out to parties as a teenager. Anne froze, trying to hide the phone behind her back. But it was too late. Tom stepped closer and held out his hand. "Let me see, Anne. You've been on that phone like a teenager lately. What are you hiding?" Her heart pounded, and she tried to laugh it off. "Nothing, Tom, just a text from Linda at work about meeting next week." But he didn't believe her. His face hardened, and he grabbed the phone from her hands before she could react, and opened the messages, where Nate's name was posted at the top with the same text about the sunset and meeting. Time seemed to slow down as Anne stood watching Tom read, his brows drawing together and his lips pressed into a thin line, and she felt the world crumble around her because this was the moment she had dreaded but knew deep down was inevitable, like the changes of age she saw in the mirror every morning, the new gray hairs or wrinkles that reminded her that life goes on and relationships can change, even when you try to hold on to them. Tom looked up at her, and his eyes were cold as ice, without the warmth they sometimes held on holidays or when Sarah called with good news. "Who's Nate?" he asked quietly, but there was a sharpness in his voice, like a knife that cuts without warning. "And why does he text you about sunsets and meetings? Are you seeing him, Anne?" "Behind my back," she tried to explain, the words tumbling out of her. "Tom, it's not what you think. We're just friends. He works at the coffee shop. We talk, nothing more." But he shook his head, throwing his phone on the table so it rang, and said, "Friends, you're lying to my face. I've seen how you've changed in the last few weeks, these uninvited smiles, these evenings when you're supposedly going to Mary's or to the store. Do you think I'm blind, or just a fool who doesn't notice?" They stood in the kitchen, surrounded by bags of groceries that had never been unpacked, and Anne felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back because she knew this was about to happen, the thing they had been avoiding for years, a real fight, where all the pent-up resentments would come pouring out like water from a broken dam, washing away everything that was left of their marriage. Tom turned his back to her, leaning against the counter, his shoulders tense. "How long has this been going on? A month? 2? You slept with him?" Anne shook her head, her voice shaking. "No, Tom, it wasn't anything like that. We were just walking, talking, and he listens to me, you know. He really listens, not like you, who are always in your head, in your work, in your garage." He turned around abruptly, his face flushed with anger, but his voice remained cold. "Oh, that's it. I'm not listening to you. Have you ever listened to me? All these years I've been building this house, paying for everything, providing for our family, and what have you been doing? Sitting in your office complaining about the routine? I thought we were a team, Anne, but it turns out you want the attention of some young guy in a coffee shop." She took a step closer, feeling the resentment boiling inside her. "Team? Where was this team when I asked you to talk, to go somewhere alone, just to be together? You always brushed it off: work, fatigue, football on TV. I feel invisible next to you, Tom, like I'm just a piece of furniture in this house." He laughed briefly, without joy, and this laugh cut her harder than the words. "Invisible? And what do you think I feel? Do you think it's easy for me to go to this job every day, to design these damn bridges, knowing that at home I have a wife who looks at me like I'm nothing? Remember how 5 years ago I wanted to change jobs, to go to another firm that paid more, but you said no, too risky, we have Sarah, a mortgage. I listened to you, stayed, and now you accuse me of routine. This is our routine, Anne. We both created it." She sat down at the table, her legs buckling, and answered quietly but firmly, "Yes, we both are. But I tried to change things. I suggested therapy, trips, even that stupid dance. And you? You just sat there and waited for everything to get better on its own. And now that I've found someone who makes me happy, even for a moment, you suddenly woke up. Tom came closer, his voice growing louder. Happy? With some Nate? He's what, 15 years younger than you? This isn't happiness, Anne. It's a crisis, like everyone our age. Do you think I don't notice how time flies? My hair is turning gray, my back hurts after work, but I don't run to the first barmaid I meet for attention. I stay faithful, because that's the way it is in the family. The dialogue flowed like a river that nothing could stop, and Anne felt all the years of silence, all the unspoken grievances, surging out, making the air in the kitchen heavy, almost suffocating. Faithful? She asked, standing up and looking him in the eye. What about emotional loyalty, Tom? You were here physically, but where were you when I was going through menopause, when I felt old and unattractive? You didn't even ask how I was feeling. You just said it was normal. Everyone gets through it. And Nate, he sees me, he understands me, he makes me feel like I'm still alive. Tom slammed his fist on the table, but not hard, just to let his emotions out. Alive? And you think I'm dead? I work hard so that we can have this house, this life, so that Sarah can go to a good college. Family responsibilities are not romantic, Anne. They are reality. Do you think I didn't want something different? Maybe I dreamed of trips, of new hobbies too, but someone had to be an adult to hold everything in hand. She finally began to cry, tears rolling down her cheeks. Adult? You just hid behind this adulthood, Tom. We could have grown together, changed, but you chose to stand still. And now, when I try to find myself, you accuse me of betrayal. Yes, I am guilty, I lied, but that is because it is useless to talk to you, you do not listen. They moved into the living room because the kitchen was too small for such words, and Tom sat in his chair and Anne on the sofa opposite, with a coffee table between them covered with family photographs Sarah at graduation, the two of them on a beach in Florida 10 years ago that seemed like a mockery of their lives now. What's next, Anne? He asked coldly, crossing his arms. Are you going to go back to this Nate guy? Get a divorce? What are we going to tell Sarah, our friends? Have you thought about the social consequences? How everyone will whisper poor Tom, his wife has taken a younger lover. She wiped her tears with her sleeve. I don't know, Tom. I didn't plan it. But now I see how empty our marriage is. No warmth, no connection, just habit. We're like two strangers living under the same roof. Maybe divorce is the way out, so that we can each find our own paths of personal growth. He shook his head. Emptiness. You created the emptiness, Anne, with your secrets and lies. I trusted you, thought we would survive this crisis, like all couples our age, but you chose the easy way out, flirting with someone who only sees you as a novelty. Moral dilemma? You betrayed not only me, but our family. The argument went on for hours, talking about the past, about how Tom had worked more since Sarah was born and Anne had felt like a single mother, about how he had wanted another child, but she had refused, afraid she couldn't cope, about petty grievances like forgotten anniversaries and unrequited hobbies. Remember how I wanted to go to Europe for our 20th anniversary, Anne said, her voice hoarse with tears. You said it was too expensive, we'd better save it for retirement. And now retirement is near, so what? We never went anywhere, Tom replied. And do you remember how I suggested we buy a boat so we could go to the lake on weekends? You said it was dangerous, Sarah was too young, and I said no. We both sacrificed, Anne, but you decided your sacrifices were more important. They shouted, then they were silent, then they spoke again, and in those breaks Anne saw the fullness of the emptiness. Their marriage was like an empty vessel that they filled with routine but not love, and this realization burned her more than the guilt before Nate or the fear of the future. Finally, Tom got up and went into the garage, saying goodbye. Sleep in the guest room tonight, Anne. I need to think. She was left alone in the living room, looking at the pictures, and she thought that this was the end of something that had died long ago, but they hadn't wanted to admit, and now the truth was out, cold and sharp as Tom's knife. She picked up the phone, but she didn't text Nate. Instead, she called Sarah to hear her voice, but her daughter didn't answer, and Anne felt even more alone, thinking about the trust that was lost forever, and how age made all change so painful. Only 3 days had passed since that kitchen quarrel that had torn her and Tom's life into before and after, and Ann Harper already felt how her whole world, carefully built over years of marriage, work, and motherhood, was beginning to crumble like an old brick fence under the pressure of an autumn rain, where each blow of a drop knocks out another piece, exposing the voids that she had previously ignored, preferring to think that everything was held together by habit and duty and not by real strength. She sat in her car in the parking lot of a supermarket in suburban Atlanta, where she had stopped just to get home from work, and she stared at the steering wheel, gripping it so hard her knuckles were white because Sarah had called from Boston that morning, and her voice didn't have the usual easygoing tone of a college girl sharing stories about her classes or new friends, but instead had the cool detachment of a judge handing down a verdict, and Anne knew that Tom had probably told her everything before she had had time to gather the strength to talk to him. "Mom, Dad said you were seeing someone," Sarah had said without preamble, her words echoing through the phone as Anne stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into a mug that suddenly felt too heavy. "Is that true? Are you really cheating on him?" Anne tried to explain, her words tangling like the threads of an old sweater she hadn't worn in a long time. "Sarah, honey, it's not that simple. Your father and I grew apart a long time ago, and this man. He was just a friend who made me feel alive again, but I didn't want to hurt anyone." But her daughter cut her off, her voice rising to a scream. "A friend? You expect me to believe you? I always thought you were the strong one, Mom, the one who held this family together, and now you're a traitor. How could you? You and I have always been close, and you didn't even tell me that your marriage was in trouble. I feel betrayed, like everything you said about trust and family was a lie." The conversation hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette Anne did not smoke, but now she wanted to light it, to occupy her hands and take her mind off the pain in her chest, because Sarah, her only child, whom she had raised with such love, nursed at night, taken to dancing lessons, and supported through her first heartaches, was now looking at her across hundreds of miles as if she were a stranger, and this betrayal in the eyes of a child was worse than any quarrel with Tom, because it concerned not only the past, but the future. How to deal with Sarah now, with this rift between them, full of disappointment and questions about morality, about what it meant to be a mother in a world where personal desires clashed with family obligations. Anne got out of the car and walked into the supermarket, pushing the cart down the aisles of canned goods and fresh vegetables, but she couldn't see anything around her because Sarah's words were running through her head. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Mom. You've ruined everything I knew about our family." She bought a tub of the ice cream Sarah had loved as a child and a carton of milk, even though there was plenty of it at home, just to keep herself busy. But at the checkout, the cashier, a woman her age with tired eyes, said, "You look like you've lost something important, honey. Is everything okay?" Anne nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, it's just been a rough day." But inside she was screaming because she really had lost it, her daughter's trust, built up over years of sleepless nights and school plays, and now that trust was falling away like dry leaves underfoot in the park where she walked with Nate, and the thought of him now brought not only warmth but also bitterness, because the price for those moments of freedom had been too high. That evening, when Anne returned home, she found that Tom had gone to his sister's for dinner, leaving a note on the refrigerator. "I'll be late, don't wait up." And the house seemed even emptier than usual, with the echo of her footsteps on the parquet floor and the silence that pressed on her ears, forcing her to remember how Sarah's laughter used to sound here, or conversations with Tom about plans for the weekend, which now seemed distant, like memories from another life. She called Mary, her friend she'd seen at the mall, hoping for support because Mary was divorced and knew what it was like to go through a relationship crisis. But when Anne started to say, "Mary, Tom found out about Nate and Sarah. She's furious, she feels betrayed," her friend paused, and then her voice grew cool as an autumn wind. "And I love you, but it was predictable. You knew you were risking everything by flirting with that guy. I'm not judging, but a lot of our mutual friends already know Tom told Bob, and Bob told Linda, and now everyone's whispering. You know, Jane from our book club said to me today How could Anne do that? At her age, with her adult daughter? I've been defending you, but maybe you should think about whether this is worth it. Anne felt the ground slipping from under her feet. Even Mary, who had always been on her side, was now withdrawing, not directly condemning, but making it clear that support had its limits, and this withdrawal of friends with whom she had shared dinners and picnics and conversations about life was like a stab in the back, because in the American suburbs, where everyone knew everyone else through work or church, such stories spread quickly, turning into gossip over coffee or barbecues, and Anne imagined the neighbors looking at her with pity or condemnation, whispering, "Poor Tom, such a stable couple they used to be, and she." The next day at the office, things got even worse. Linda, her colleague with whom she had shared her thoughts about marriage, came to her desk during her lunch break, but instead of the usual chat about TV shows or recipes, she sat down across from her and said quietly but firmly, "Anne, I heard from Mary about your friend. I don't want to judge, but this is not nice. You know how we feel about such things. Family comes first. If you want to talk, I'm here, but be careful, the boss might hear gossip, and it will affect your promotion." Anne nodded, feeling her cheeks burn with shame, and replied, "Linda, it's not what everyone thinks, but thank you for being honest." But inside, a storm was raging. Friends were distancing themselves as if her act was contagious, and this condemnation, open or hidden, was intensifying her internal crisis, where questions about personal growth were mixed with a sense of guilt, because she had always considered herself a good wife and mother, someone who puts family above all else, and now she saw how this image was crumbling, leaving her naked in front of the mirror of social expectations, where a woman of her age should be a bastion of stability and not seek adventures that destroy everything around her. That evening, Anne decided to call Sarah again to try to fix it, because the pain of breaking up with her daughter was the sharpest, like a knife piercing her heart, and she sat on the veranda of the house, looking at the garden where Tom had planted flowers last summer, but now they were withering without care. "Sarah, please listen to me," she began when her daughter answered after a long dial tone. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I love you more than anything in the world. But there has been so much emptiness in my marriage with Dad that I'm just lost." Sarah sighed, and there was a mixture of anger and tears in her voice. "Mom, are you lost? What about me? I thought I had a normal family, and now everything is in ruins. Friends ask me why I'm sad, and I don't know what to say. You betrayed not only Dad, but me too. I was always proud of you, and now I'm ashamed. How can I trust you now?" Anne began to cry, the words caught in her throat. "Darling, I'm sorry. I didn't think it would go this far, but I'm human too, with mistakes, and I'm trying to find my way back to myself, to the growth I've lost in the routine." But Sarah interrupted. "Growth? That's an excuse, Mom. You destroyed our world, and now I don't know how to put it back together. Don't call me yet, I need time." The phone went silent, and Anne sat in the darkness, feeling her inner crisis reaching its peak. The world built by years of work, love, and compromise was crumbling around her, leaving her alone, where guilt intertwined with a desire for freedom, and she wondered whether to start over or try to glue the pieces together. But there were no answers, only echoes of condemnation from friends and pain from her daughter, which echoed in her soul, making her realize how fragile this world really was. Ann Harper sat in an old wooden rocking chair on the back porch of their home in suburban Atlanta, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold on to the warmth that was escaping from her body into the cool evening air, where the first stars were already piercing the darkening sky and the neighbors' dogs barked in the distance, reminding her of a life that went on beyond the chaos within her. It was early October, and the leaves in the garden that Tom had so loved to tidy now lay unraked, piles of orange and yellow, symbols of how their lives, once neatly trimmed like a lawn, were now overgrown with the weeds of missed opportunities and unspoken words. It had been a week since Sarah had refused to talk to her, hanging up and asking her not to call, and 3 days since Tom had moved into the spare room on the second floor where he now slept, leaving their shared bedroom empty, like a museum after closing, with only the echo of footsteps to indicate that there had once been life there. Anne hadn't seen Nate since that fight, hadn't responded to his texts, which had come daily at first short, concerned ones. "Anne, are you okay? Is something wrong?" And then less frequently, until they stopped altogether, and the silence from him was both a relief and a new wound, because she had grown accustomed to his words, to his attentions, which she now understood were not just friendship, but something more, something she had allowed to blossom without thinking about the consequences. She looked out at the garden, where the wind was rustling the leaves, and she felt her thoughts, usually scattered between work and family and the fear of judgment, begin to focus on a single point, like a magnifying glass focusing sunlight to burn through paper. Anne had retreated into herself, like a refuge where no one, not Tom, not Sarah, not the friends who now avoided her at church or at the supermarket could reach her. But it wasn't a cozy refuge. It was cold and full of questions she was afraid to ask, but that now demanded answers like an insistent knock on the door. What had she been looking for when she started talking to Nate in that coffee shop? A man who looked at her with admiration. The youth she'd lost somewhere between mortgage payments and Tom meetings, or herself the Anne who'd once dreamed of travel, of new horizons, of a life full of meaning and not just a schedule. These questions swirled around in her head like leaves in a whirlwind, and she knew the answers would not be simple because they required an honesty she had avoided for years, hiding behind the role of wife, mother, colleague, so as not to look into the mirror of her soul, where the reflection might be unfamiliar. Anne stood up, grabbed a blanket from the living room couch, and walked back out onto the porch, wrapping herself in it because the cold outside was easier than the cold inside, where every corner was a reminder of her mistakes. She remembered how, as a child in a small town in Ohio, she had loved to sit on her grandmother's porch and listen to her tell stories about her youth, how she had given up her dream of becoming a teacher to get married, and how the stories always ended with the phrase, "Don't make the same mistakes I did, Anne. Always listen to your heart." Anne had thought it was just old age advice then, but now, at 48, she wondered if she had ever listened to her heart at all. Or had she simply followed a script: college, marriage, baby, job, home that felt right, but left her as empty as a scorched field after a fire? She took her phone out of her pocket, opened the gallery, and found a photo Nate had taken in the botanical garden. She was standing by a bed of roses, laughing, covering her face with her hand, and in that picture she saw herself not Tom's wife, not Sarah's mother, but a woman who was still capable of joy, of being light, of being alive. But that photo also caused pain, because it reminded her of the price she had paid for those moments: the break with her daughter, Tom's coldness, her friend's judgment. The next day at the office, Anne worked mechanically, checking insurance policies and answering letters, but her mind was elsewhere, in a labyrinth of self-reflection where she was trying to figure out what had brought her to this point. Linda, her co-worker, came up to her during a break, holding a cup of coffee, and said, "Anne, you look like you haven't slept in a week. Do you want to talk? I know everyone's talking about you, and, well, but I'm not one to judge." Anne looked at her, feeling a lump in her throat, and replied quietly, "Thank you, Linda, but I don't know what to say. I'm confused. I thought I was looking for something new, but now it seems like I've just been running from myself." Linda nodded, sitting down next to him. When I found out my first husband was cheating on me, I was furious, but then I realized he wasn't looking for another woman, but a way out of his sadness. Maybe you weren't looking for this, Nate, either, but something you were missing. Don't be too quick to judge yourself. Give it time." These were the first words that didn't condemn, but offered understanding, and Anne felt her chest lighten a little, although she still had questions. That evening she decided to go to church, where she and Tom went on Sundays, although in recent weeks she had avoided these services, knowing that there would be whispers behind her back. But today she needed a place to sit in silence, away from the house where every glance from Tom was an accusation. The church was empty, only the pastor, an older man named Richard, was preparing the hall for the next service. He noticed her sitting in the last pew and came over. "Anne, I haven't seen you in a while. Is something wrong?" She wanted to brush him off, to say that everything was fine, but instead the words came out. "Richard, I've done something wrong. My family is falling apart, my friends are turning away, and I don't know who I am anymore. I thought I was looking for happiness, but I think I've just ruined everything." The pastor sat down next to her, his voice gentle but direct. "We're all looking for meaning, Anne, especially at your age, when life makes you look back and ask, what's next? But happiness doesn't come from other people, it comes from within. You're not the first one to get confused, but you need to be honest with yourself. What do you want? Not for your husband, not for your daughter, but for yourself." The words hit her like a pebble thrown into water, creating ripples, and she wondered, what did she want? Nate, his attention? Or just that feeling when you see yourself in the mirror again, not as a shadow, but as a person? At home, Tom was in the living room, watching an old Western, and the sound of gunshots from the TV was cutting into his ears. Anne sat down on the couch, feeling how the distance between them had become almost physical, like a wall that could not be climbed over. "Tom, we need to talk," she said quietly, but he did not turn around, only answered, "About what? About your boyfriend? Or about how Sarah cried on the phone because she did not know how to look at you now?" She swallowed tears. "I did not mean for this to happen. I did not sleep with him, Tom. It was not an affair in that sense, but I am guilty because I was looking for something that I was missing here with you. But I do not know what it was: youth, love, or just myself." He finally looked at her, and in his eyes there was not only pain, but also fatigue. "Do you think it is easy for me? I feel that we are stuck too, but I did not run off to look for someone else. We could have talked, Anne, we could have tried, but you chose to lie. And now Sarah won't come home because she can't stand the sight of both of us." The words hit like a hammer, because Anne realized that what she had done had not only destroyed their marriage, but had robbed Sarah of the sense of home that had been her anchor in life. She went into the bedroom, closed the door, and pulled out an old shoebox where she kept letters and photographs from her youth letters between her and Tom when he was away on an internship in another state, pictures from their wedding, her in a white dress and him in an awkward tux, smiling like they owned the world. She flipped through them, and each picture was a sting, showing how far they had come from the people who had sworn to be together through thick and thin. What was I looking for? She asked herself, and the answer began to form, slowly, like a puzzle being put together in the dark. Nate wasn't the goal, he was the symptom, a mirror that showed her how much she had lost herself in the routine of being a wife and a mother, forgetting that she was a person too, with desires and dreams and fears. The betrayal, although not physical, was her attempt to breathe life into that emptiness, but instead it destroyed what could still be saved. The next day, she made an appointment with a therapist, a woman named Carol, whom she had found through a recommendation from a colleague because she realized she couldn't do it alone. In a lavender-scented office with overstuffed chairs and a box of tissues on the desk, Anne told him everything about the marriage, about Nate, about Sarah, about the friends who had turned their backs on her, about the questions that kept her awake. "I thought I was looking for youth," she said, looking out the window at the trees beyond, "or for a man who saw me, but now I realize I was looking for myself. But I don't know who I am anymore after all this." Carol nodded, her voice calm as a lake. "Anne, you made a mistake, but this isn't the end. You're searching for meaning, and that's okay. A midlife crisis isn't about cheating or having affairs, it's about coming to terms with who you've become and deciding who you want to be next. Start with forgiveness of yourself, of Tom, of Sarah. It's a long road, but it starts with honesty." Anne cried as she listened, because for the first time, someone wasn't judging her, but offering her a way forward, even if it was painful. That evening, she wrote Sarah a long letter, not on the phone but on paper, as she had done when she was younger, pouring out everything: her fears, her guilt, her love. "Honey, I'm not making excuses. I made a mistake, but I want you to know that I will always be your mother, and I will work to earn your trust back." She sent the letter, not expecting a reply, but feeling that it was a first step. She hadn't spoken to Tom, yet he was too distant, and she knew it wasn't time, but she was beginning to see that their marriage, even if it didn't survive, was not just an emptiness, but also a foundation on which she could build something new if she found the strength. Her internal crisis had reached its peak, but in this peak there was also a liberation. She realized that betrayal was not a goal, but a symptom of her search for herself. And now, standing among the wreckage of her world, she began to ask a new question, not, "What have I lost?" but, "What can I create?" And this question, although frightening, was like the first ray of light in a dark room where she had been hiding for too long. Ann Harper stood by the window in their old living room, where the sunlight filtered through the slightly yellowed curtains, casting patterns on the floor like a web of memories, and watched Tom tinkering around in the garage, his figure hunched over a toolbox, so familiar yet distant, as if he were an actor in a movie she had seen 1,000 times, but was only now beginning to notice the nuances in his movements, the slight tremor in his hands as he picked up a wrench, or the way he sometimes paused, staring into space, as if listening to the echo of his own thoughts, which were perhaps filled with the same doubts and fears as her own, built up over years of both of them keeping silent, so as not to disturb the delicate balance of their daily lives. It had been almost 2 weeks since the night she had sent Sarah the letter, and there had still been no reply, but in the silence Anne had found space to think, not about Nate, not about the pain of her friend's judgment, but about Tom, the man with whom she had shared more than half her life, but whom in recent years she had seen as little more than a shadow, a backdrop to her own dissatisfaction, forgetting that he was a man too, with his own scars from time, with dreams that might have been extinguished by the weight of his responsibilities, like the light bulb in the garage that he kept putting off changing because there were more important things to do. She decided that today she would try to look at him differently, not as a stranger who simply took up space in the house, but as a partner lost in a labyrinth of habits, where each day was repeated like a looped film in an old projector, and where fear of change, fear of loneliness, fear of admitting weakness held him captive, just as they had held her captive until she decided to take the step that turned everything upside down. Anne poured 2 cups of coffee, his favorite, black and strong, no sugar, the kind he always drank in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table and reading the paper, though in recent years he had switched to his phone, scrolling through the news with the same vacant expression he always had, and went out into the garage, where the smell of engine oil and dust mingled with the aroma of coffee, creating a strange but comfortable bouquet, reminiscent of the time when they first bought this house, and Tom would spend hours fixing things up, and she would bring him sandwiches, and they would talk about their plans for the future, about how Sarah would run around the garden, and they would have barbecues for the neighbors. "Tom, I thought you might need this," she said, holding out her cup, her voice softer than it had been in days, without the edge that had laced their rare conversations when they exchanged phrases about bills or groceries, avoiding each other's eyes as if looking might reveal too much. He looked up, surprised to see her. She usually kept out of the garage, considering it his private space, a refuge from the world where he could be alone with his thoughts, and took the cup, murmuring, "Thank you, Anne. I didn't expect that." They stood in silence for a few minutes, him sipping his coffee and her looking at the tool shelves with their old cameras and boxes of blueprints, and she thought how long it had been since he had spoken enthusiastically about his work, about the bridges he designed, seeing them not just as concrete and steel, but as symbols of the connection between people, as he had once explained to her on their first date, comparing their love to a bridge across the river of time. "Tom, can I sit here with you?" she asked, pointing to an old chair in the corner, covered in a layer of dust, but he quickly brushed it off with a rag, and she sat down, feeling how the garage, this man's corner, had suddenly become a space for the dialogue they had avoided for so long. He nodded, sitting down on an overturned box, and they began to talk, not about the scandal, not about Nate, but about small things, about how he was fixing Sarah's bike, which had been there for years, because what if she comes home and wants to ride it like she did when she was a kid? And in these words Anne heard not just practicality, but fear that his daughter would not return, that their family would fall apart completely, and he, Tom, would be alone with these tools and memories, without the support that she, Anne, had always been for him, even when they were growing apart. "You know, I always thought that if I worked hard, everything would work out on its own," he said suddenly, looking at his cup as if the coffee could contain answers to questions he'd never asked out loud. "But now I see that it was an illusion. I was afraid to change anything, Anne, because remember when my father lost his job and we moved 3 times? I didn't want Sarah to go through the same thing, so I held on to stability like a lifeline. But that lifeline became a cage for both of us. Anne listened, and her heart sank at his unexpected candor. She saw him not as a cold husband, but as a man held hostage by his fears, raised in a family where change was associated with loss, and that made him as vulnerable as she was, with her fears of aging and losing herself in routine. They talked about the past, about that trip up into the Appalachian Mountains 10 years ago, when they'd stayed in a little motel by the road, and the rain had poured all night, and they'd lay in bed listening to it pound the roof, and Tom had told her about his childhood dreams of being an architect, of building not just bridges, but buildings that would change cities, but then he'd chosen engineering because it was safer, and Anne thought about how that safety had become their shared prison, where they both hid from risk, from emotion, from life. I didn't blame you before, Tom, she said, taking his hand, and it was the first touch in weeks, warm and awkward, like in their youth. I saw you only as a wall, but now I understand that you too were lost in this routine, where the days merge into one, and your fears about losing your job, about letting us down made you so withdrawn. Our story is not only my pain, it is our common road, with turns that we missed together. He squeezed her hand in response, and a tear flashed in his eyes, which he quickly brushed away. Yes, Anne, I was afraid to talk about it too. I thought that if I admitted to being tired, I would show weakness, and a man should be strong, as I was taught. But now, after everything, I see that we were both hostages, you to your searches, I to my habits. Maybe it's not too late to turn around. They left the garage and walked around the block, where the leaves crunched under their feet, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke from neighbors' fireplaces, and Anne fantasized about being young again, but with a wisdom of age, driving to that motel in the rain, but now talking not about dreams, but about reality, about overcoming fears together. Remember how we used to fantasize about a house on a lake, she asked, and he smiled for the first time in a long time. Yeah, with a boat and fishing in the mornings. I still think about it sometimes, but I was afraid it was stupid at our age. Anne nodded. It's not stupid, Tom. It's our story, and we can continue it if we see each other not as enemies, but as partners in this journey. They returned home, and although nothing was resolved in one evening, Anne felt a shift. Their marriage had become a shared narrative, full of mistakes and hopes, where each of them was not a victim but a co-author. And this understanding opened the door to something new, however unclear, but full of potential. Autumn rain pounded the rooftops of suburban Atlanta, creating a soft rhythm that accompanied Ann Harper as she drove down the wet road toward downtown, where Nate, who had texted her that morning, was waiting for her in a small cafe on the corner of Midtown, its windows fogged up from the heat inside. We need to talk, Anne, it's important. She parked at the curb, watching the raindrops slide down her windshield, and felt her heart tighten with anticipation, not the thrill of a month ago, when their walks and conversations had been a breath of fresh air, but the knowledge that this conversation might be their last, because their connection, which had begun as a spark, was now smoldering under the weight of her life, filled with guilt, broken dreams, and trying to figure out who she was after everything she had done. Anne smoothed her hair, glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing the tiredness in her eyes, and got out of the car, pulling the hood of her raincoat up to keep out the rain, but knowing in her heart that no amount of protection would save her from what lay ahead. At the cafe, Nate sat by the window, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a tense posture, fiddling with the edge of a paper napkin and his phone face down, as if he didn't want to be distracted. Anne sat across from him, ordering tea instead of her usual latte, because coffee was now associated with their first meetings, which had seemed so innocent, but had led to this moment where everything was on edge. Hey, Nate, did you want to talk? She began, trying to sound calm, though her voice was shaking like a string stretched to its breaking point. He looked at her, and his eyes, usually warm and mischievous, were now a mixture of sympathy and weariness. And I don't know how to say this, he began, looking away toward the window, where the rain was making patterns on the glass. I like you very much, I really do, but I can see that you're struggling with something bigger than just us. Your family, your daughter, your husband, they're not just the backdrop, they're your life, and I feel like I'm becoming part of the problem, not the solution." His words were a cold shower, but not unexpected. Anne had already noticed how he texted less often, how their conversations, once full of laughter and dreams of travel, had begun to boil down to cautious questions about how she was coping with the situation at home. She nodded, clutching her teacup. "I understand, Nate. You didn't sign up for this, for my problems, for my guilt. I thought that you were my salvation, but now I see that I was just looking for a way out of the cage I'd trapped myself in." He reached across the table, brushing his fingers against hers, but it was a different touch than before, not a spark, but a farewell. "You're incredible, Anne," he said quietly. "You have something I've never seen in anyone, but I can't be the one to ruin your life. I'm young, I have my own dreams, my studies, my photography, my travels, and I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between me and your family. It's too hard for both of us." Anne felt the tears welling up in her eyes, but she held them back, not out of pride, but because she realized that their connection, as bright as it had seemed, was built on her escape from reality, not on anything lasting. "Thank you, Nate, for your honesty," she said, trying to smile. "You gave me moments when I felt alive again, but I can't build happiness on someone else's pain. Please don't blame yourself." They talked for a few more minutes about the weather, about his upcoming exhibition, but the words were as empty as the cup she drank her tea from, and when they said goodbye at the door, his hug was as short as the period at the end of the sentence that closed the chapter of their story. When Anne returned home, she found Tom in the kitchen, cooking dinner, a rarity since it was usually her territory, and the smell of roast chicken with rosemary filled the house, reminding her of the evenings they had first married, experimenting with recipes, laughing at the oversalted food or the burnt sauce. He looked at her, and there was none of the coldness in his gaze that she had seen after their argument, but rather a cautious curiosity, as if he, too, were trying to figure out who they were to each other now. "Where have you been?" he asked, stirring the pan, and his voice was not accusatory, just tired. "With him again," Anne shook her head, sitting down at the table. "No, Tom, we met to say goodbye. It's over." I realized that he was not the answer to my questions, but only a reflection of them. Tom nodded, not looking up from his cooking, but his shoulders were relaxed, as if he'd been waiting for the words, but was afraid to hear them. "So what now?" he asked, setting a plate of chicken and vegetables in front of her, the simple act of having dinner cooked by him like a small bridge across the chasm that had grown between them. "Do we just continue on as if nothing happened, or are you leaving?" Anne looked at her plate, at the neatly cut carrots and potatoes, and thought about how this dinner had been his attempt, however clumsy, to bring back something of their past, and it made her heart clench with a mixture of hope and pain. "I don't know, Tom," she answered honestly, picking up her fork but not eating. "I don't want to break up our family, but I also don't want to live the way we used to, when we were just neighbors under the same roof. I want to rethink us, but on new grounds, not out of a sense of duty, but out of a desire to be together if we both want to be. But to do that, we'll have to talk, really talk, and not hide behind habits." He sat down opposite her, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time in years, and said, "I'm tired of this too, Anne. I'm no saint, and I know I shut you out because I was afraid that if I started talking about my fears about my job, about age, about Sarah growing up, it would all fall apart. But it's already fallen apart, and I don't know how to build it up again, but I'm willing to try if you are too." The conversation was the start of something new, not a return to the old marriage of silence and compromise, but an attempt to create something different, where they could both be honest, vulnerable, real. They talked until midnight, remembering not just the hurts, but the moments that connected them, the time they'd danced at his sister's wedding even though they both couldn't, or the time they'd rescued the puppy Sarah had found by the side of the road, and how those memories weren't just the past, but a foundation to build on. Anne talked about her fear of being invisible, about how Nate wasn't a lover, but a mirror that showed her what she'd lost. And Tom confessed how he'd been afraid that his job, his stability, was the only thing holding their family together, and how he'd felt useless when she'd started to pull away. The next day, Anne wrote Sarah another letter, not expecting a response, but feeling she had to keep trying. Honey, I know you're angry, and you have a right to be. I made a mistake, but I'm learning to be honest with myself and with Daddy. We're trying to find a new way, not for the sake of the old way, but to be the family you deserve. I love you and will always be there for you when you're ready to talk. She sent the letter, feeling the guilt ease a little because it was a step forward, a small one, but a sincere one. Anne faced a choice: break up the family, go into the unknown, where she could search for herself alone, or stay and try to build a relationship with Tom on new grounds, not out of fear or habit, but out of a desire to understand each other. She chose the latter, not because it was easier, but because she saw in Tom not only a husband, but also a person who was also struggling with his demons, and their shared history, full of mistakes and hopes, was too valuable to throw away. They signed up for couples therapy, and although the first sessions were awkward, full of silences and tears, they began to learn to listen to each other, as if getting to know each other all over again, and it was like the first step along a path in the forest, where the way is unclear, but each step forward opens up new horizons. The December air in suburban Atlanta was cool, not sharp, but soft, with a hint of pine from the neighbors' Christmas trees that had begun to appear on their lawns, festooned with lights that twinkled in the twilight like stars falling to earth. Ann Harper sat in her car, parked outside her house, but she was in no hurry to get out, because something new was happening inside her, something almost tangible, a sense that she was finally beginning to see herself not through the lens of the roles she had played for decades, but as a person whose life, despite all the mistakes and losses, was her own. It had been 2 months since she had said goodbye to Nate in that cafe in the rain, and a month and a half since the night she and Tom had started talking, really talking, not hiding behind walls of habit or blame, and those months had been a journey for her. Not along roads that led to new cities, but inward, searching for answers to questions she had once been afraid to ask. She looked at the house she and Tom had bought 20 years ago, its white walls darkened by time and its garden now covered in a thin layer of snow, and thought about how that house, like their marriage, had been both a refuge and a cage, but now she was learning to see it as a space in which she could build something new, if only she could find the courage. The house was warm inside, smelling of cinnamon from the candles she had lit the night before in preparation for Christmas, though this year the holiday felt different, less like a ritual than an opportunity to rethink what it meant to be a family. Tom was sitting in the living room, leafing through an old photo album they had pulled out last week when they had gone through boxes in the basement to find decorations for the tree. He looked up as she entered, and his face, usually tense in recent months, softened into a small smile. "You've been sitting in the car for a long time," he said, putting the album aside. "Are you thinking about something important again?" Anne nodded, taking off her coat and sitting down next to him, feeling how the sofa where they had spent so many evenings in silence was now a place for conversations that had begun with difficulty, but were gradually becoming easier, like breathing after a long run. "Yes, Tom," she said, looking at a scrapbook of her and Sarah on the beach in Savannah when she was 5, building a sandcastle and laughing despite the wind blowing their hats away. "I was thinking about us, who we were, who we've become, and who I want to be. I've been just a wife, a mother, a co-worker for so long that I've forgotten that I'm also myself and, with my dreams, my fears, my desires." Tom nodded, a hint of understanding in his eyes, as if he, too, had been through his own internal labyrinths over the past few months. "You know, I've thought about this too," he said, turning the page of the album to find their wedding photograph, their young, hopeful faces. "I always thought that my job, our home, the stability, that was my role, that I had to be the strong one, the one in control. But when all this with Nate came out, I realized that I'd been hiding behind that role because I was afraid to show that I was tired too, that I had doubts. I'm not a saint, Anne. I've made mistakes too. They've just been quieter than yours." His words were honest, without the anger that had boiled in their fights, and Anne felt her heart clench with gratitude for this vulnerability that he rarely showed. "We were both hiding, Tom," she said, taking his hand, and the touch was not just a gesture, but a bridge they were beginning to build anew. "I was looking for myself in Nate, in his attention, because I couldn't find myself here, next to you. But now I realize it wasn't about him. It was about me, about losing my identity in the routine, in the roles I played for everyone but myself." They continued talking, their conversation moving from memories to plans, from pain to cautious hopes. They remembered how they had once, in the early years of their marriage, dreamed of going to Italy, but had put it off because of Sarah's birth, then because of the mortgage, then because of work, and how that dream had become a symbol of their lives on hold. "Maybe we should go," Tom suggested, his voice uncertain but also hopeful. "Not to fix everything, but to start something new, together, as partners, not as people who just lived under the same roof." Anne smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that the idea didn't seem like a pipe dream. "Yes, Tom," she replied, "but not just a trip. I want us to start over, not pretending that nothing happened, but accepting everything, our mistakes, our fears, our history. I want to be with you, but not like before, but as people who choose each other every day and not out of habit." Sarah still hadn't responded to the letters, but a week ago she sent a short message. "Mom, I'm not ready to talk yet, but I got your letter. I need time." Those words were like a small ray of light in a dark room, and Anne clung to them, knowing that rebuilding her daughter's trust would be a long road. But she was willing to take it because she now knew that loving Sarah was not just a mother's role, but a part of her own identity that she was no longer going to lose. She began going to therapy not only with Tom, but also alone, with Carol, who helped her sort out her desires, and in one session Anne said, "I thought that cheating was my rebellion against life, but now I see that it was a cry for help, my way of saying that I was losing myself. And now I'm learning to be honest, not just with Tom, with Sarah, but with myself." Carol nodded, writing something down in her notebook. "And you found your identity not in Nate, not in marriage, but in this journey, in the pain, in the mistakes, in the questions you finally asked. That's your strength, being honest with yourself, even when it hurts." Anne began to take small steps toward herself. She enrolled in a ceramics class she found at a local arts center, and every Wednesday night she molded clay into vases and bowls, feeling her hands, so used to the keyboard, come alive as she created something new, imperfect, but her own. She bought a ticket to a jazz concert at a small club downtown, which she went to alone, not because Tom didn't want her to, but because she needed that time to herself, to stand in a crowd and listen to the saxophone and feel that she was not just someone's wife or mother, but also Anne, who loved music, who could laugh at her awkward dancing in the dark. Tom supported her, though sometimes he looked at her with surprise, as if he were seeing a new woman, and this surprise was not condemnation but curiosity, which pushed him to change too. He joined a fishing club, something he had dreamed of for years, and one day he brought home a catch that they had cooked together, laughing when the fish almost burned, and it was like a return to the times when they were young, but with a new wisdom that made their laughter deeper. Their marriage was not the same, and Anne was glad of it, because theirs had been full of silences and compromises that had stifled them both. Now they were learning to be honest about their fears, about how Tom was afraid of losing his job and Anne of becoming invisible at her age, about how they both missed Sarah but knew she had to find her way. They were planning a trip to Italy for the spring, not as an escape, but as a way to get to know each other again, and Anne imagined them walking the narrow streets of Florence holding hands, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She wrote another letter to Sarah, telling her about ceramics, about the concert, about how she was learning to be not only a mother, but also a woman who wanted to be worthy of her love, and sent it, not expecting an answer, but feeling that each such step was part of her new identity, where she was no longer running from herself, but moving towards her. Anne stood by the Christmas tree she and Tom had decorated the previous week, looking at the lights that flickered like her own hopes, sometimes brightly, sometimes softly, but never dimmed. She didn't know what would happen next, whether Sarah would come home for Christmas, whether she and Tom would be able to build a marriage that was alive and not just conventional, but she did know that her path of betrayal full of pain and destruction, had become a path to inner honesty, where she had finally found herself not just as a wife, not just as a mother, but as Anne, a woman whose life was her own. And that choice to live for herself, not alone, but in connection with those she loved, was open like a book she had just begun to write, every page full of possibilities. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.